What if a corpse, discarded and forgotten, brushed against the remnant of a prophet, and in that touch, life returned? Imagine a lifeless body thrown into a cold cave, the earth still clinging to it, and then, by a simple contact with an old man's bones, breath seizes again. It sounds like a story told to stir the imagination, yet the Bible records this very scene as a sign, as an unexpected proof of a truth that runs like a hidden thread through a whole ministry. God's life-giving power does not end with death. That truth is at the heart of what we're about to unveil. Unveiling the miracle secrets of the Bible, the untold truth revealed. This is not a promise of a formula. It is not a cheat sheet for guaranteed outcomes. It is an invitation to gaze once more at the pages of Scripture and notice patterns, textures, and themes that point to how God chooses to act, often through ordinary people, simple objects, and unlikely circumstances. We will trace those threads through one prophetic life above all, Elisha, the man who carried a mantle and inherited a double portion of a prophet's heart. His story, found across 2 Kings, is a fresco of signs, small, startling, and profoundly theological. These signs together form the secrets we will unpack, not secret formulas, but hidden lessons about God's compassion, continuity, and sovereignty. If you want more deep Bible stories unlocked and to keep hearing these untold truths from Scripture, go ahead and subscribe and like. This helps these truths reach others. Northern Israel in those days was a land of rusted idols and frayed loyalties. The throne sat uneasy, caught up in the ambitions and alliances of kings like Ahab and the persuasive influence of his queen. Worship, once simple and centered, had been complicated by commerce and politics. In that soil of compromise and crisis, prophets rose as strange counterpoints. They were not princes nor generals. They were voices in the wilderness, sometimes voices that shouted and sometimes ones that stubbornly whispered. Elijah was the towering figure of that generation, a prophet known for thunderous encounters with heaven. See 1 Kings 17-19. When Elijah appeared, storms seemed to orbit him. A confrontation on Mount Carmel that left the nation in awe. A wilderness sojourn sustained by ravens and miraculous meal. A sacral confidence that drew the attention of kings and the ire of court power. And out of that familiarity with God's thunder, another life was about to begin, one that would demonstrate a different face of the divine, patient continuity. Elisha was not cut from the same cloth as the charioteered prophet who left in a whirlwind. He was, by every human estimate, ordinary. He came from Abel-Meholah, a place of fields and watercourses, of plowshares and early morning labor. Picture him there, calloused hands on the wooden beam of a plow, the raw scent of turned earth in his nostrils, the lowing of oxen in the air. This is not the image of a man suited for spectacles. It is the image of a man anchored to the soil. Yet sometimes the soil itself becomes a stage for destiny. The Bible chooses small details that reveal huge truths. It tells us of Elisha taking 12 yoke of oxen, tearing them apart, cooking their flesh, and giving the meat to the people. Then he set out and followed Elijah. 2 Kings 2:23-24, 1 Kings 19:19-21. That gesture, burning the plow and breaking the implements of farming life, was not mere theatrics. It was a decisive moment that burned the bridge behind him, a visible surrender of a former life to step fully into a prophetic vocation. It was also a risk. When you destroy your safety nets, you either discover a providential God or learn hard lessons about consequences. Elisha chose to trust. And that trust, radical and costly, is the first of our revealed secrets. Miracles often begin where we are willing to abandon our old securities. There is power in the symbol Elijah carried, the mantle. It was not an expensive garment. It was a coarse cloak, the kind a traveler or a prophet might wrap around his shoulders. But it bore meaning. When Elijah cast his mantle toward Elijah, it was a transfer of authority, a visible sign that the prophetic presence and responsibility were being passed on. 2 Kings 2:8-14. This was not a simple inheritance like passing down a family heirloom. It was a commissioning in the public sphere, witnessed by the sons of the prophets and by the curious eyes of those nearby. The mantle's fall announced a continuity. God's work would not stop with Elijah. Elisha's response to that act of commissioning was dramatic and humbling. He asked for and received, in trembling faith, a double portion of Elijah's spirit, a phrase that echoes the legal language of the firstborn's inheritance. 2 Kings 2:9-10. In their culture, the firstborn son received a double share of the estate. Elisha's request was not greed, but longing. He wanted to carry, in measure and authority, the prophetic ministry forward. Elijah warned him that it depended on whether Elijah would witness Elijah's being taken away. And when the whirlwind came, the chariot of fire and the fiery horses, Elijah was carried up in unmistakable divine spectacle, and Elisha watched until that last gust lifted him beyond sight. 2 Kings 2:11. It was the moment that made the request matter. Seeing the mentor go, seeing heaven's hand move, confirmed that the mantle's authority was now Elisha's to steward. The scene on the banks of the Jordan is cinematic and instructive. Elijah strikes the water with his mantle, the river parts, and the two cross on dry ground. 2 Kings 2:8. It is a picture of God making a way through the impossible. But then the focus shifts. It is not Elijah's power per se. It is the Lord's power that answers a prophet's cry. When the mantle falls and Elijah picks it up, he strikes the water and the river parts again, but now in his hands. The crowd of prophets becomes witness to a transferring of pattern. Authority moves, continuity happens, and God's purpose presses forward. The double portion is not a trophy. It is a charge, a responsibility to see the same God move in a new season through new hands. If the mantle was one piece of the secret, continuity through visible symbol, there's another strand we must notice, the ordinariness through which God worked. Elisha's beginnings as a farmer matter because many of his later miracles involve household staples and everyday danger. He teaches us that the sacred is at work in the mundane. Salt, oil, a pot of stew, an axe head, these are not spiritual curiosities, but the very tools of life. When God's power meets such simple instruments, the result is a narrative that proclaims His compassion for everyday people. In other words, the secret is not that God prefers the extraordinary, it's that God delights in redeeming the ordinary. But to reduce Elisha to a mere worker of wonders is to miss a more sobering aspect of prophetic ministry. It cost him his comfort. When you stand as a prophet in a land where kings prefer blurred truth, you quickly learn that prophetic life moves between praise and persecution, between hospitality and exile. Elisha's ministry was not only a series of wow moments. It entailed intercession in grief, judgment against injustice, and unflinching admonition when the people strayed. His miracles were responses to urgent human needs. Bitter water made sweet so mothers could drink. Widow's oil multiplied so children would be fed. A mother's son brought back from death so a household's hope would be restored. Each sign answered a human cry. In the pattern we'll trace, miracles are never spectacle for spectacle's sake. They are the tangible expression of God's heart towards suffering people. There is another theme that threads through these accounts and which the title Untold Truth asks us to highlight: the theological idea of succession. In our moment, the word evokes bureaucracy, offices, and institutional ladders. But in the biblical narrative, succession is spiritual continuity. The mantle passing from Elijah to Elisha shows that God equips and hands off his mission. The prophetic task is not a one-person show. It is a relay where the runner hands the baton and the race continues. This means miracles are often embedded in communities that outlast one leader's life. The double portion Elisha sought speaks to this. He wanted the ability to carry the work forward, to make God's presence known in his generation. That hunger for continuity, anxiety about who will carry on, shapes every major move of his ministry. Let us pause and listen to the geography of this story. These events are not aloof. They unfold in villages and valleys. Jericho's waters, the cramped house of a widow, the room prepared for a prophet's hospitality in Shunem. Each location is textured with smell and sound, the tang of briny water, the clink of oil jars as they are opened and filled, a mother's footsteps pacing the floor in grief. The scriptures mark these places with citations for us to return to. See 2 Kings 2, 2 Kings 4, 2 Kings 5, 2 Kings 6. They are not meant as mere footnotes, but as doorways into lived faith. This is the point where the miracle secrets begin to gather like constellations. One secret is obvious: God can and does use ordinary things. Another emerges as we study pattern. Miracles often arrive through a chain of faith-shaped actions: listening, obeying, moving with humility, persistence, and sometimes oddity. Elisha's responses were often simple. He might pour salt into bitter water, or tell a grieving mother to rest and wait. But they required trust. They required that people act on God's word, even when the steps seemed insignificant or embarrassing. The secret is not procedure, it's posture. Take humility. Consider how Naaman, a commander of a foreign army, had to be unclothed of pride before he could be healed. 2 Kings 5. He was invited to bathe in the Jordan 7 times, a regiment that looked beneath his dignity. The story reveals a recurring truth. God's pathways to healing and restoration often ask humility as a condition. The miracle itself is God's gift, but the heart's posture, whether it receives with stubborn entitlement or with contrite openness, matters in the narrative. There is also an unmistakable thread of spiritual warfare woven into these accounts. When a king's army sought to capture Elisha, he saw in an instant the mountains filled with horses and chariots of fire, an overwhelming vision of God's hidden host protecting his servant. 2 Kings 6, 15 through 17. The revelation was both terrifying and tender. Terrifying in the scale of the unseen power, tender in the protection it afforded the prophet who served faithfully. That scene teaches a secret many Christians find hard to see. The world we touch is not only physical, it is layered with spiritual realities that guard, press, and interact with our lives. The revelation of the heavenly army brings an urgent posture of watchfulness, but also an assurance of God's guarding presence. As we survey these patterns, a question forms. How does the story of a rough-coated farmer become a record of consistent, public, and community-shaping miracles? The answer is both human and divine. On the human side is a chain of relationships: the mentorship of Elijah, the disciples who gathered around, the households that opened their doors, and the community that both benefited from and challenged the prophetic voice. On the divine side is God's consistent character. He is compassionate, sovereign, patient, and working through history toward redemption. The untold truth unwrapped in Elisha's life is that God's power often chooses to be mediated through human vulnerability and communal structures, not around them. We must be careful, and the scriptures guide our caution. When we read that a dead man came alive upon touching a prophet's bones, the text does not invite relic worship. Instead, it calls us to see God's sovereignty in action. This was God's act, not an endorsement of relic worship. The Bible intentionally records miracles that unsettle us and force theological reflection. Its aim is to point beyond the object to the one who works. That tension between wonder and worship, between the instrument and the instrumenter, is critical to maintain. We will return to that in full because the Bones episode is both climactic and theologically delicate. But before we race to the cave where life returns to a corpse, we must stay with the beginning of the ministry: calling, mantle, and the immediate aftermath. After Elijah's departure, Elisha did not become a celebrity with a neat program. The sons of the prophets, not just one or two disciples, but a network of prophetic communities, began to coalesce around him. These were not mere apprentices. They were a prophetic fellowship, a company that lived and prayed together, anticipating and sometimes challenging the prophet's ministry. They served as witnesses to the continuity we mentioned earlier, training grounds for the future, and partners in bearing burdens. Elisha's early days as the recognized prophet are marked by immediate practical issues. A community that needed water restored, a widow terrified by debts, a woman of Shunem desperate for a child. These were the raw human dramas that gave his prophetic identity shape. They show an important principle. God's miracles frequently answer the immediate, practical needs of people. The spiritual is not divorced from the material. In the text, the care of a widow's pantry is as sacred as a vision on a mountaintop. Therefore, one of the secrets we begin to unveil is sacramental in nature. Ordinary acts done in faith become channels of God's extraordinary provision. Consider the scene of a widow whose children face hunger and exploitation because of debts. The terror of losing children into slavery was not abstract, it was a social reality. Into such desperation, Elisha speaks a word. Go gather jars and pour your single jar of oil into them, then sell the oil to pay your debts, live on the rest. The instructions sound almost absurd. Bring every empty vessel, pour oil into them. And yet the narrative shows multiplication that cannot be explained apart from God's intervention. 2 Kings 4:1-7. The secret here is not the oil itself, but the obedient act of faith in response to God's word. A small thing, given away, becomes the means of provision. Another vignette moves us from sustenance to the reversal of grief. A woman in Shunem, who had shown hospitality to Elisha whenever he passed through, is given a child as a blessing from God through the prophet's word. Later, when the child dies, the prophet returns and the child is restored to life. 2 Kings 4:8-37. The story pulses with intimacy. A prophetic voice, a hospitable heart, and a tragic wound that yields to mercy. It reveals the secret that God's miracles often intersect with relationships established in kindness. Generosity, attentiveness, a willingness to welcome the prophetic, these human acts become the soil in which God's restorative power takes root. At the same time, we must keep in view the broader social canvas. The nation was not a sealed community of like-minded people. Naaman, the commander of Syria, represents the foreigner who stood at the edge of Israel's religious life, commanding armies, wealthy, and yet afflicted with leprosy. His story and his humbling at the banks of the Jordan illustrates a global truth. God's mercy reaches beyond borders. The miracle secrets are not confined to Israel's names and faces. The invitation to humility and the willingness to obey a prophet's word, no matter how undignified, are key elements in the pattern. To trace Elisha's ministry is to watch a rhythm set: problem, prophetic action, miracle, reflection. Each stage points beyond itself. No single sign is a complete theology. Each one contributes a stanza to a larger hymn. The recurring elements, ordinary means, communal context, necessary humility, and the central sovereignty of God compose the chorus that will be our guide. As Elisha stepped into the mantle's weight, the small community around him watched, learned, and sometimes resisted. Prophetic ministry, by its nature, presses against comfort. The sons of the prophets who inhabited the periphery were both students and testaments to the continuity of calling.
They would provide the next generation of witnesses to a God who moves across time through a chain of faithful servants. Now, poised at the river's edge and with the mantle in his hand, Elisha is not yet finished making decisions. He is about to walk from the banks of Jordan into towns and homes that will call for more than words. People will bring him jars, children will be sick, armies will move, and the unseen will press against the seen. The mantle has been cast, the mantle has been taken, the double portion has been asked for and set upon his heart. But the true test of those requests and promises would not be a one-time wonder. It would be the daily grind of answering cries, speaking truth to power, and trusting God's presence in every small action. So we prepare now to follow Elisha into the first set of miracles that reveal the structure of God's action in his ministry. The purification of bitter water at Jericho, the multiplication of a widow's oil, and the birth, death, and resurrection of a child in Shunem. Each will teach us a facet of the secrets we have sketched, how ordinary means become conduits of provision, how humility unlocks healing, how relational kindness becomes the stage for restoration.
But before we step through those doors, we must acknowledge one last uncomfortable truth that shadows any conversation about signs. People often seek the spectacular without attending to the cost of discipleship. Elisha's life was not a string of stage tricks. It was a life surrendered to service. And that surrender required relinquishing security, accepting hardship, and embracing a dependence that was often invisible to the casual observer. If you felt in your own life the pressure of a call that demands risk, a relationship to steward, a vocation to be defended, a prayer that seems to go unanswered, then Elisha's early choices will resonate. He did not ask for the double portion to aggrandize himself. He asked to bear a heavier burden for God's people. The secret here is moral as well as miraculous. The authority to witness God's power often accompanies a load of responsibility. And so the curtain lifts on the scenes to come. We will move now from the banks of the Jordan and the smoky memory of Elijah's departure into villages where water tastes bitter and widows count their jars. We will stand at the threshold of households and watch as small acts of obedience become stages for God's mercy. We will glimpse healing that asks for humility and protection that reveals unseen chariots of fire. Each episode is a lantern lighting up a different corner of the same room, the room where God chooses to dwell with a people in need. But first, one more image to carry forward: a mantle folded on a stone, a rough cloak that smelled of dust and desert rain. It was simple, ordinary, and yet it marked a transfer of heaven's touch. That mantle's meaning is not exhausted by its fabric. Its power, if power is the right word, is derivative. It points to the Lord who calls and sustains. Keep that picture with you. It is the emblem of a secret that we are only beginning to unveil. God's extraordinary work is often sewn into ordinary cloth and handed to ordinary people. Now, with the mantle's edge still warm from the hand that cast it, we will step into the first miracle, going to Jericho, where bitterness will be made sweet and where a simple prophet's instruction will reveal something deep about how God tends the wells of life. They arrived at Jericho like a band of tired people moving toward a well that had gone sour. The city lay in the valley, the sun bouncing off its low stone houses, and its water, once a blessing, had turned bitter. Mothers came with jars. Children took tentative sips. The complaint reached the new prophet. The land is spoiled, and life felt like it had lost its savor. Elisha stood listening. 2 Kings 2:19-22. He did not mount a platform or call for a sacrifice. He asked a simple question: what is there to do? Then he did something strikingly ordinary. He took what he could find, salt, and cast it into the spring. He spoke a word, and the water began to taste sweet. Here is the deep, disorienting part of prophetic life. The presence of God does not always mean, now you have no sorrow.
The Shunammite story presses into a darker secret. Miracles often intersect in holy places with suffering and do not always arrive on our timetable. Yet a miracle does come. Elisha returns, prays, stretches himself upon the child, and life returns. 2 Kings 4:32-37. The sequence teaches two things. First, hospitality and humility are not merely virtuous habits. They create a context in which God's mercy can be encountered. Second, prophetic intercession is not a stage act. It is sacrificial, embodied, and sometimes tenderly physical. The prophet's refusal to leave, his repeated kneeling, the whisper of prayer, these are the gritty activities by which God's restorative power is engaged. Between these larger, emotionally charged episodes sprout smaller, domestic miracles that reveal a consistent theology of God's care for community. One day, the sons of the prophets, those who lived and learned in community, prepared a stew for the workers, and it was unknowingly made with poisonous gourds. Panic rose. The men cried out that the food would kill them. Once again, the answer was astonishingly simple. Elisha threw flour into the pot, and the stew became harmless. 2 Kings 4:38-41. What does this teach? That God cares about the tiny hazards that jeopardize a group's survival. That the divine touch can be meditative and patient. The remedy required no elaborate ritual. It required a prophet willing to step into the swamp of ordinary danger and to speak order into it. Not long after comes a moment of comic surprise that also carries theological weight. A young man borrowed an axe to help fell a tree. The head came loose and fell into the water. The tool, indispensable for the work at hand, sank into the dark. The panic was practical. Without the axe, the job and wages would be at risk. Elisha cut a stick, threw it in, and the iron floated. 2 Kings 6:1-7. The scene holds both humor and hope. Iron, a heavy material, floats on a prophet's instruction. It is a picture of God's power disrupting the laws of our expectations to keep work going, to maintain livelihood. Once again, the secret is simple. God often preserves the dignity of ordinary toil through extraordinary intervention. Yet, alongside these acts of provision and healing, the narrative introduces a dimension of the unseen. When enemies conspired, when the Syrian armies sought to capture Elisha, the prophet's servant saw only the plain landscape and the overwhelming numbers of horses and chariots in their tents. Elisha, unalarmed, prayed, "Lord, open his eyes." The servant's eyes were opened, and the hills were filled with a burning host of horses and chariots, angels arrayed to protect God's servant. 2 Kings 6:15-17. The vision was terrifying in its scale and tender in its purpose.
It revealed a secret few would expect. God's protective power frequently operates in a dimension we cannot perceive. Spiritual warfare in Elisha's world is not a metaphor. It is a layered reality. But every such revelation also carries consolation. God's people are not alone. The prophet who sees into heaven can narrate the invisible activity of the Lord, and in doing so, he invites others to trust despite appearances. The Dothan episode, 2 Kings 6:8-23, also teaches a posture. When the king of Syria sent troops, Elisha did not summon an army. He prayed for blindness on the soldiers and led them, safely bound, into the heart of Samaria. Then, instead of executing them, the king's steward and Elisha choose mercy. They feed the men, release them, and the Syrian king is shamed into call off attacks. Mercy reconfigures the arc of conflict and reveals a secret about divine strategy. Victory is not always the crushing of an enemy. It can be the conversion of their intentions through unexpected grace. God's power can shame a planner by changing his heart. Into this tapestry of food, tools, and visions walks a man who seems, by every human measure, immune to Israel's God.
Naaman, commander of Syria's army, a war hero bathed in the authority of his victories, was afflicted with leprosy. He came with wealth, prestige, and the desperate hope that he might be healed. 2 Kings 5. His journey to Elisha's court was punctuated by pride and offense. The prophet did not meet him with trumpets. He sent a servant with simple instructions. Go wash 7 times in the Jordan. Naaman sputtered indignation. Could not the rivers of his own land, richer, more stately, be sufficient? The order looked beneath him, and it required him to surrender dignity to receive healing. But Naaman's eventual humility led to restoration. He immersed himself in the Jordan 7 times. The scales fell away. He was clean. The moment is one of the clearest lessons of Elisha's ministry. Obedience, even when it seems trivial or humiliating, is essential to receiving what God offers. The narrative refuses to craft a formula. It does not propose that one must always wash 7 times to be healed. Instead, it sets a precedent. Sometimes God's pathways to remedy require the renunciation of pride and a willingness to act in small, obedient steps. Naaman's conversion also models the wideness of God's mercy. Here is a foreign soldier, outside Israel's covenantal borders, touched by the living God. The secret is unmistakable. God's compassion can cross political boundaries. His grace is not contained by national identity. And yet, even in this generous account, Elisha's role is not to manufacture miracle, but to point to God's mercy and to require a posture of humiliation that aligns the heart with divine remedy.
Each of these episodes, Jericho's salt, the widow's oil, the Shunammite's loss and restoration, the neutralized stew, the floating axe, the chariots of fire, the humbling of Naaman, pulls at a common thread. Miracles in Elisha's life are lived theology. They show how God moves in history, through simple means, within community, often requiring humility, and always subject to His sovereign will. They are not mechanistic keys on a keyring to be used at will. They are invitations to participate in God's redemptive work. And then there is the final, startling scene that will not leave a reader alone: the strange revival at a prophet's tomb. Years later, as recorded in 2 Kings 13:20-21, Elisha died and was buried. Time moved on. People continued to live with the memory of his ministry, and the sons of the prophets maintained their companionship and service. One day, a man was buried hastily in a tomb, and in the night marauders intruded, or perhaps circumstances forced quick burial, and the body was left half-hidden. When the men who were burying decided to flee from raiders, they hastily threw the lifeless body into the tomb where Elisha lay. The corpse scraped against the prophet's bones. Life returned, the man revived and rose to his feet. Stop and feel the weight of this incident. It is dramatic. It is disconcerting. It forces theological caution. What should we make of it? First, the biblical record is careful to frame the event as an act of God. This was God's act, not an endorsement of relic worship. The narrative refuses to condense the tomb into a talisman. The power was not in the bones per se as an autonomous magic. Rather, the event stands as a testimony to God's sovereign freedom to work, even through the memory of a faithful servant, to restore life. The bones function as a narrative hinge that points not to idolatry, but to God's ongoing lordship over life and death. The untold truth here is not that relics are keys. It is that God's life-giving power can manifest in ways that defy our tidy categories, because He is God. There is an uncomfortable theological texture here we must not ignore. In our age, it's tempting to either sentimentalize or debunk such a story. We must resist both. Sentimentalization turns the bones into an object of cultic devotion. Skepticism strips the text of its theological freight. The balanced posture is reverent wonder plus caution.
We affirm that God, who raised the dead and called into being what was not, remains sovereign and creative in how he displays his life-giving power. Elisha's bones, then, function as a narrative crescendo to the priority we have been tracing. God's work does not terminate at human death. His purposes and presence continue to ripple through communities and generations. That ripple is the same theme that began when a mantle fell and a river parted. It is the secret of continuity, that God invests in succession and stewardship. The prophetic mantle did not end with a whirlwind.
The community kept moving. The sons of the prophets learned to accept leadership and to watch for God's hand in their own lives. Elisha embodied the shift from single prophet charisma to a prophetic movement that extended beyond one lifetime. The tomb miracle, surprising and solemn, testifies to the rhythm of divine continuity. God's purposes are woven into time in ways that testify beyond the life of one hero. How then do we read these secrets for our own age? If the Bible's untold truth about miracles is that they often happen through ordinary things, that they demand humility, and that they serve communal restoration, then our response must be shaped accordingly. Here are a few principles, phrases that might better be called invitations rather than formulas. First, expect God to move through ordinary means. The sacred shows up in the pantry, at the well, in the cracked jar you choose not to hide. When you approach life with eyes attuned to God's subtle handiwork, you begin to see that everyday things can be sacramental. Second, embrace humility as posture. Naaman's healing and the Shunammite's grief both teach that healing and restoration often require the renunciation of pride. Humility does not earn God's favor like a coin in a vending machine. It positions the heart to receive grace. Third, obedience, even when it feels tiny or ridiculous, is a doorway. The widow's multiplication required her to gather vessels. The children who unknowingly swallowed poison were saved by a simple act. God honors the small, awkward obedience of those who step into faith's shape. Fourth, community matters. The sons of the prophets, the hospitable Shunammite, the widow's neighbors who lent jars, all show that miracles in Scripture are rarely isolated accomplishments. They flourish in networks of care and witness. Fifth, expect spiritual realities beyond the visible. The tabernacles of fire and the armies of heaven are reminders that God works in both seen and unseen realms to protect and promote His purposes. We should not be surprised when the spiritual dimension intersects the physical. Sixth, steward continuity. If Elisha sought a double portion of his mentor's spirit, then a key secret is this: God's mission is a relay. We are called to steward what has been entrusted to us, equipping the next generation to bear the mantle forward. But the practical implications are not only theological abstractions. They press on daily life. What does it look like to live these secrets? It looks like choosing to be generous with what you have, even when scarcity pinches. It looks like accepting tasks that feel beneath you, because they may be the very path to restoration. It looks like forming communities of mutual support where the fragile and the bold are both welcomed. It looks like praying for eyes to see the chariots at work and for courage to act when fear demands flight. It also looks like caution. We must not turn these stories into a program for guaranteed success. Miracles in Elisha's story are marks of God's compassion, not steps in a spiritual algorithm. They invite faith, but they do not coerce. They call for obedience, but they do not reward it like a vending machine dispenses a snack. Above all, they point to the God who owns life and death, mercy and justice, and who chooses in His wisdom when and how to reveal His power. By now you have seen the pattern. You have seen salt and oil, stew and axe, chariots and bones. You have witnessed humility and hospitality, obedience and community. You have watched how ordinary moments are transfigured by divine presence. The Bible's miracle secrets are not secrets like a code to crack. They are truths about how a relational, sovereign God intersects our ordinary existence with His redemptive power. So, what is the untold truth for you today? Perhaps it is this: God's activity in the world is often less about spectacle and more about sanctifying the everyday. He chooses to display His glory in kitchens and wells, in rooms prepared for guests, and in the hands of those who are willing to obey. He does not treat His people as tools, but invites them into partnership. If you find these truths stirring something within, an echo of a long-held hope, or the gentle ache of a need, then take a small step. Maybe it is the practical step of offering what you have, however small, to someone who needs it. Maybe it is the posture of humility in a relationship that has become prideful. Maybe it is reaching out to build a community or to welcome a stranger. These are not magical acts guaranteed to conjure a miracle. They are faithful responses that place you where God can meet you. The story of Elisha closes not with instructions on how to control God, but with a portrait of a God who keeps covenantal faithfulness alive across generations. It refuses easy recipes and instead hands us an ethic. Be humble, be obedient, be communal, watch for the unseen, and steward what you have been given. These are the miracle secrets not because they unlock a supernatural machine, but because they reveal the character of a God who prefers to work through the ordinary people He calls. Before we close, one final caution and comfort. Caution: never treat the miracles like talismans, especially the episode of the bones. This was God's act, not an endorsement of relic worship. Comfort: the same God who raised the dead and cleansed the leper continues to be at work. He is not constrained by human death or human failure. His mercy can surprise, restore, and continue the work of His servants long after they've gone to their rest. If this untold truth has stirred something in you, I invite one specific next step. Take a moment right now to name a small thing you can offer. Your time, a meal, a listening ear, a prayer of humility, and do it this week. Watch how ordinary obedience opens the door for God's compassion to move. Thank you for walking through these pages of Scripture with patient attention. If this exploration of Elisha's life, its signs, its ordinary instruments, and its surprises has been a help, consider watching 2 more videos that dig into prophetic succession and the life of Elijah. They will deepen this conversation and help you see how God's work threads through generations. Subscribe if you want more biblical stories unpacked with reverence and practical application. May the God who calls ordinary people to extraordinary service give you eyes to see the ordinary means He wants to use, hands willing to act in humble obedience, and a heart willing to steward His mercy across generations. Go in the assurance of His sovereignty, the tenderness of His compassion, and the company of those who run the race with you.